Hello folks, my name is Mayank Dwivedi. Today we are going to discuss Lecture 1 Part 3 Sources of History. Today we are going to discuss primary and secondary sources as we have discussed previously, archaeological sources and literary sources. Now we are going to discuss the sources based on their nature. Primary and secondary sources used in reconstruction of early Indian history can be broadly divided into categories of primary and secondary sources. This classification can be based on relationship of source with a particular development or particular time period. The primary source contains first-hand account of the writer as he was there as a witness in case the source is literary. And the secondary source contains second-hand account or interpretation of the writer. In case of secondary source, the writer was not present at the spot when the event took place. His knowledge about development is described by him as he drawn it from other sources. In case of primary sources are contemporary in nature, whereas the secondary sources belong to different time period. Primary sources are original source, whereas the secondary sources lacks originality. Let us take a question from previous year. Critical examination of positive and negatives of primary and secondary sources. It needed 125 word answer. It was asked in UPSC. We will go with the basic design, intro, body and conclusion. For intro, primary sources as contemporary sources and secondary sources means the writer was not present at that time. Sometimes in case of archaeological sources, there are only some as example of secondary nature. For example, Junagadh rock inscription of Rudradamna. It can be classified as a category of secondary source. As I said, primary source is likely to be more accurate because it provides contemporary information of the first-hand account, as primary sources provide detailed information about the incidents, development which are described in it. A primary source could suffer from limitation of personal bias of writer, especially if writer was a court poet. Such a scholar living under patronage of the king are likely to glorify the achievements of the masters and overlook their failures. In case of secondary source, it has benefit of avoiding personal bias of a particular writer because author of secondary source enjoys a freedom to draw information from multiple sources. For example, Raj Tarangani, a secondary source, can cover longer period of time. Because of this, a longer phase of human history can be comprehended by using one of a particular work itself. A secondary source have advantage of providing chronological details because the event belonging to different time periods can be classified chronologically without much difficulty in a secondary source. Like primary source, secondary source can also suffer from limitation of personal bias because if secondary source has drawn its information from a particular primary source or a limited primary sources are available for that time period, then it can also suffer the bias of the writer of the primary source. So you got the pros and cons about the primary sources and the secondary sources. From this you can make your body. And conclusion, it's your homework. Try to conclude by yourself. Let us take some examples of primary and secondary sources. As I told, both literary and archaeological sources can be classified into primary and secondary source categories. While most of literary works fall in category of secondary source, but most of archaeological evidences fall in the primary source category. But there are some exceptions. The evidence gathered through excavation, exploration are mostly primary because these belong to the same period or because these belong to a particular period. But in case of some inscriptions such as Junagadh rock inscription of Rudradamna, it can be classified as secondary source because as he described, Chandragupta Maurya was the founder of Sudarshan Lake and then it was repaired by Asoka and then by him. In case of literary work like Arthashastra, Kamdaka's Nitichar, Harsh Charitra of Banbhatt, these are primary in nature. Literary work such as Mudra Rakshasa of Vishakha Datta are secondary in nature because Vishakha Datta lived in 6th century and his book Mudra Rakshasa deals with Mauryan period. And a particular literary work can be described as primary and secondary both in nature because it can have non-contemporary and contemporary information at the same time. For example, Raj Tarangani written by Kalhana. It contains history from Mahabharat age to the middle of 12th century. As for the last part, Kalhana was eyewitness, so it can be considered as a primary source, whereas the event belonging to the earlier period would fall in secondary category. So we can say both primary and secondary sources are equally important for reconstruction of early Indian history because both supplement and complement each other. One type of source can be used for examine the authenticity of other type of source. Let's talk about schools of early Indian history and their approaches in study of early Indian history. Let us take it also as an answer. So for introduction, as we know, ever since the commencement of history writing in modern age in India, a number of schools have been immersed in contest of reconstruction of Indian history. These schools and scholars associated with the schools use different approaches as per circumstances in which they emerge and the objective they are trying to accomplish through the history writing. We can divide them in 4 parts. Let's talk about the first, colonial school of early Indian history. This school emerged during opening decade of 19th century. The company official and Western scholars were associated with this school. They interpreted Indian history to suit the needs of British colonial rulers. Scholars like V.A. Smith, H.H. Wilson, James Mill were associated with this school. Colonial historian presented a distorted picture of early Indian history to justify the establishment of British rule. They focused on highlighting the limitation of Indian life. The achievements were deliberately neglected. Everything bad was considered Indian and everything good was portrayed as contribution of foreigners. This school focused on political history primarily, that too history of elite class. Phases of Indian history were divided along the religious line, Hindu period and the Muslim period and then the British period. Certain periods of Indian history were portrayed as dark ages to shatter Indian pride and self-esteem. Dark age refers to the phase of human history during which the progress was completely absent. Postmodern period, early medieval age and the 18th century presented as the dark ages of Indian history. It was emphasized that the India was invaded by foreigners during this period. The political unification was absent. No progress of any kind was there in political, socio-culture or economic life of Indians. The idea of dark ages was used to justify the slogan provincial mission or white man's burden. It was emphasized that British came to India to uplift natives from prevailing darknesses. The communal outlook was dominant in historical interpretation put forward by colonial scholars. Their objective was to put one Indian community against other so that the policy of divide and rule could be used successfully. Let's talk about the second school, the nationalist school of early Indian history. This school of Indian history emerged during 1840s and 1860s. Historians like R.C. Mazumdar, H.C. Roy Chaudhary, K. Neelkant Shastri were associated with it. The nationalist school of Indian history emerged as a reaction of negative propaganda being utilized by colonial historians. They were motivated by desire to interpret Indian history in positive light so that the spirit of national pride could be infused among the Indians. Their interpretations were aimed at strengthening the foundation of Indian nationalism to provide positive ideas to Indians struggling against British rule. To counter the concept of dark ages, the nationalists put forward the idea of golden age. The golden age refers to the phase of human history during which the all-around progress was very high and a high order of progress was witnessed. For that, Gupta period was presented as a golden age. The nationalist historian also suffered from many limitations, such as the picture of early Indian history presented by them was distorted towards positive. Nationalist historian deliberately neglected the limitations and failures. They also focused on political dimensions and the elite class, like their colonial counterparts. The religion-based classification was continued by them. The third school, Marxist school of early Indian history. This school of Indian history emerged during 1960s. Scholars like R.S. Sharma, Irfan Habib, S. Sharkar, D.D. Kosambi are associated with it. These historians focused on the economic factor shaping human history. They focused on socio-economic dimensions in reconstruction of history, and they neglected the political dimensions. Greater significance was attached to the role of common masses, peasants, workers in making of Indian history. This approach is also known as history from below, also known as subaltern approach. It is associated with Marxist school. It was originated by Ranjit Guha. Like earlier schools, Marxist school also suffered from presenting incomplete picture of early Indian history. Fourth and last one, multidisciplinary approach. This approach was emerged during 1990s. It is being followed by most historians at present. This approach endeavors or try to reconstruct Indian history in balanced manner without getting affected by any particular ideology. This approach focuses on elements and changes and continuity in Indian history. On the basis of these elements, periodization of Indian history was carried out instead of following religion-based classification of Indian history in 3 phases. It follows 5 base approach. For our course, we are going to follow this one. Ancient India up to 750 AD, early medieval India 750 to 1200 AD, medieval India 1200 AD to 1700 AD, early modern India 1700 to 1800 AD, the modern India 1800 to the present. This approach relies on archaeological and other evidences gathered through scientific examination of past so that the history could be reconstructed in most truthful manner. So we can say that this approach is scientific. Please like, subscribe and share this video with your friends. Thank you. Mayank Dwivedi signing off.